Welcome. Today's post is, Buffalo Bills O.J Simpson. Published on January 12, 2023. What are the odds of this? January 27, 1991. Buffalo Bills' first of 4 consecutive Super Bowl losses. 3 days later, on January 30, 1991, The Silence of the Lambs releases, focused on catching Buffalo Bill. So, coincidence? If not, then what's going on here? It's a deep rabbit hole, so let's get into it. Here are the topics we'll be decoding today. You can always find this list in the description below. If you enjoy this video, please press the like button, and subscribe for weekly full-length blog posts, and shorter, more shareable videos. Let's begin. Intro. What are the odds on this one? January 27, 1991. Buffalo Bills' first of 4 consecutive Super Bowl losses. January 30, 1991. Silence of the Lambs, catching Buffalo Bill. The Buffalo Bills' legendary 4 straight Super Bowl losses begins the same week as the legendary film about catching a killer named Buffalo Bill. There's a reason for everything, and you know, if I talk about Buffalo Bills and killers, how can I not mention the Buffalo Bills' most famous player O.J. Simpson? The most famous court case of all time. By many measures he acted as the coin tosser and announcer in some of these legendary Super Bowl games. So, coincidence? If not, then what's going on here? It's a deep rabbit hole, so let's get into it. Disclaimer and Buffalo Bills today. When I discuss symbolism, it's always with the caveat of, I could be wrong. I'm not always right, but I've demonstrated patterns in hundreds of posts that indicate a high probability that many major news stories are orchestrated. The extent of this deception is difficult to define the edges of, but I always lay out what I think and why. I say this up front because I will never make light of a real tragedy. There are people that get severely injured or killed, and most are real stories. However, they are not all real stories. Fake news is, as the name suggests, at times dishonest. Some news stories are presented as real but aren't. Some involve injury and death that are fiction to varying degrees. I go into quite a few of them in other posts. For example, Prince Philip died at age 99 on April 9, which was the 99th day of the year. By itself you could view that as just an incredible coincidence, but when you look at the events leading up to it. February 22, 2021. Prince Philip fake obituary printed. This was highly reported on the 24th. February 24, 2021. Head of Queen Elizabeth missing, Prince Philip. January 20, 2019. Epstein's 66th birthday. Plus 202 days. August 10, 2019. Epstein death at age 66 and 6 months old. Plus 303 days. April 9, 2021. Prince Philip dead at 99 on 99th day. You see some of the choreography. Check my fake deaths post for more on this, as there are a ton of examples that even more clear than this one. Epstein, for example, also had comms leading up to his death, and the motives are covered there as well, but the point for now is simply there are fake deaths happening, so I can't just take the news at their word. Sometimes I have to dig deeper. The only way I can differentiate between real and fake deaths is by reading the symbols tied into the news and finding patterns that clarify what was actually happening versus what we are shown. For example, consider the news recently of the Buffalo Bills safety Damar Hamlin going into cardiac arrest. Said to be potentially a heart attack so rare that it only happens 20 times a year. Suffice to say, a 24-year-old highly athletic person is not typically at risk for this. Head injuries are expected, but this? If this was a show intended to send a message, what message is it? There are a few tricks that can unlock it. One relies on proximity to other events and patterns. Like, for example, how Hamlin began speaking January 6. The anniversary of the 1/6 riots, which had lots of reporting about that case continuing. Reconcile this with the initial reporting of Hamlin's injury, the man who would be speaker. What message might a Buffalo Bills safety getting a rare heart attack be? To answer this, we need to figure out the symbolism of the Buffalo Bills and Hamlin in relation to it. Once we have both of those puzzle pieces defined, we can apply the symbolism of the story itself. It's easy to assume this is a negative symbol, but we can't know that for sure yet. How could it be good? It's all contextual. If a show is put on about something bad happening to a symbol that defined bad things, then that makes it good, right? Who was the most famous Buffalo Bills player? O.J. Simpson. And we all know what he is famous for, but don't worry, I'll be decoding him later in the post. I'll give an example of a negative symbol tied to the NFL. MACK. Biggest trade in the NFL history list, and it involved a person named Mack in 2018. Does that name sound familiar in context of that year? MACK plus 2018. Was there any other Macks in 2018 that became national news? Allison Mack. Now that we've identified a possible symbol, we look at major news stories about both and reconcile them. July 25, 2018. Khalil Mack begins holdout on contract. July 25, 2018. NXIVM trial, heiress Claire Bronfman arrested leads to showdown in court with Allison Mack. This tells me the news story of this NFL holdout was likely in getting testimony, but that's only if I've identified the right symbol. It would be an incredible coincidence for the biggest trial of the year to coincidentally have the same name as the biggest trade in NFL history the same year, but let's see if the patterns continue. April 20, 2017. Raiders picked up Khalil Mack's contract. April 20, 2018. Allison Mack arrested FBI's sex trafficking conspiracy. Interesting delta. This makes it more likely, as it could indicate an op long plotted out. Perhaps Trump's mid-2017 alliance with Saudi Arabia netted him the keys to Mack. Plus 1 year they pull the trigger on it. March 16, 2022. Bears trade Mack to LA Chargers. March 16, 2022. Biden talks about blackmail in relation to his son. Everybody knows, in context of blackmail. The Biden family happens to own part of the closest major island to Epstein. Who else has been in court and tied to blackmail recently? How about Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell? September 26, 2012. Terramar Maxwell plus Epstein Ocean Project founded. September 26, 2012. CASPER, Tom Brady, and other major athletes, drinking child semen to succeed on South Park. Tom Brady equals Brady evidence keeping evidence away from court. The symbol of having major sports stars having success tied to drinking child semen seems to parallel the blackmail necessary to attach strings, which gives access to stardom. As in South Park was giving commentary on Terramar with this episode. This means that Brady's success on the field is tied to the success in keeping evidence away from courts. Possibly. And if that's the case. 2023, Brady's first losing season in 25 years. Symbol for evidence no longer being secure. Remember Tom Brady's symbolism on South Park, not just the drinking semen but an entire episode about how he keeps a vault of the most valuable feces in the world locked up. Given the juxtaposition of evidence holding suddenly less secure with Brady and Buffalo Bills safety taking an injury, what then might we derive? Not yet, we still need to decode Buffalo Bills before we can perfectly define the symbolism of what is going on. Buffalo Bills. Buffalo Bills went to 4 Super Bowls in a row and lost all of them. When I lined up the dates, something interesting jumped out at me. January 27, 1991. Buffalo Bills' first of 4 consecutive Super Bowl losses. January 30, 1991. Silence of the Lambs, catching Buffalo Bill. Quite a coincidence. Probably the most famous movie of the year has a villain in Buffalo Bill losing the same week Buffalo Bills begin a legendary losing streak. The team had a new tactic that year of a no-huddle offense that couldn't be stopped. What is the film specifically about? It stars Jodie Foster, who famously was tied to the near death of Ronald Reagan. The obsessive Hinckley shooting Reagan and killing his press secretary for Jodie Foster years before this. A film about a killer named Buffalo Bill who captures the child of a Republican senator and is set to murder and skin them alive. November 25, 1992. Costner and Whitney Houston in Bodyguard. November 3, 1992. Clinton beats H.W. Bush. The film released the same time Bodyguard about protecting Houston from a stalker. Same place the president was born. I decoded this as a symbol of protecting those that cooperate with the changeover to Clinton, i.e. not putting any executive orders out that would hamstring him. Note the lyrics are odd. If I should stay, I would only be in your way. So I'll go. These are comms of Bush agreeing not to stay around and let the takeover happen. However, I realized something obvious this week. I decoded Houston correctly, but what about Whitney? Whitney Houston. White House. Every week I'm getting better at this. It doesn't change anything about the decode but demonstrates an extra layer to it. I knew and asserted before it wasn't just about Bush, but his faction, and this symbol confirms that take as it condenses Bush plus White House into one person. Anyway. The basic symbol of Buffalo Bills looks to be of unleashing killers. Let's take a look at the 4 losses. Note first one involved Whitney Houston with the national anthem. Also former Buffalo Bills player O.J. Simpson as coin tosser and announcer. I'll get into him later, but first let's go through Silence of the Lambs. A movie about catching Buffalo Bill. A man that kidnaps women and wears their skins as clothes. Silence of the Lambs. A key aspect of any major film is understanding the symbolism of the leads. Foster adoption symbol. She was the original Coppertone girl. A brand famous for a Cocker Spaniel stripping a girl. In this film her name is Starling, and I believe it represents a future star. This fits with the film as her primary characteristics involve her being a bright student primed to succeed. She begins in training for the FBI, and it ends with her becoming an agent. The symbol of overcoming hardships include a net of capture symbolism which she climbs over. The point of this film ties into the real-life ops going on at the time tied to killers being sent to remove enemies. There are many ways this manifests, and the umbrella term for it all is MKUltra. So Buffalo Bill represents those takeover ops, which explains why he kidnaps the daughter of a prominent Republican, creating a crisis for the White House administration. In context of the film it's coincidence on whom he targets, but of course these kinds of monsters are conditioned to target specific people. The film repeats constantly how incompetent the FBI and police are at capturing these monsters and that the only way to capture Buffalo Bill is through getting the help of Hannibal the Cannibal. In an effort to capture Buffalo Bill. So, what does the Hannibal represent? Hannibal Lecter, being a psychologist, gives it away. Weak minds conditioned into becoming monsters. The avenue for someone at the lower rungs of the pyramid to move up. Hannibal Lecter likely symbolizes the child psychologists that create monsters. Burning records and moving undetected, etc. Creators of Buffalo Bill types. Getting help from the monsters that create the monsters. Lecter gives the leads necessary to catch him. To skip ahead, this concept of him helping, note in the sequel he cuts off his own hand once handcuffed and escapes. Symbol of giving up a psychopath from those inside the cell. The reach. The point is in getting help from the monsters. These terror campaigns lasted for some time until there seemed to be a concerted effort to stop. MK didn't stop, of course, but based on the comms there was an exchange tied to letting Clinton win. Unable to directly stop ops, tactics were employed to surveil and sabotage the violent brainwashing in various ways we will get into. Note the sequence leading to Hopkins cooperating. Jodie Foster gets assaulted sexually, which upsets the cannibal. In disgust, gives her the first lead necessary to catch Bill. A Miss Muffet. As in the spider rhyme. The implication here being some of the people involved in those ops agreeing to shut some down. Understanding Buffalo Bill's symbolism requires going back to the origin. Mass extermination and the taking of a new home by evicting the current residents. Note he was a celebrity that made the Pope look good and worked in early Hollywood as a showman. His history is tied to starving and scalping the Indians into submission through highly funded buffalo hunts. This ties into the modern usage as it represents takeover ops. The removal of the prior residents of a territory to take it over. This is also the symbolism of the Buffalo Bills, but I'll get more into that later. Foster's father says all the bad guys got away. Then she has a gun to their head due to a moment of distraction. Symbol of living in fear. The psychologist Lecter. Lecter kills the inmate that threw his semen at Foster with psychology. She then follows his lead and finds a victim of Buffalo Bill. He begins explaining the psychology of Buffalo Bill. Up until Lecter they had nothing, as this is justifying cooperation as a transition. This was the late 1980s and there seems to have been some desperation to fix this problem of lunatics being weaponized. It's hard to say how prominent it was without actually being in those crowds of elites. So they find the untransformed moth stuffed in the throat of the victims of Buffalo Bill. Pre-flight. This ties into a scene involving a chess board and bugs. Here we get an important comm to dissect. Chess plus bugging. Chess. What does chess symbolize? October 15, 1858. Our American cousin debut play used to kill Lincoln. October 16, 1858. Famous chess game, the opera game Morphy wins by sacrificing/mating on the 17th move. October 21, 1858. Oldest football club published rules responsible for drawing up club's rules of play. Taking the king, chess symbol equals takeover symbolism. Notice the focus on checkmating king as the objective in Q's posts. This can be done in many ways, and in Q's context it seems to involve judicial measures. Also the "our American cousin" setup already explains it. It tying to the origins of football clubs reinforces how these comms are set up in networks that are interconnected. This explains the silence of the Lamb comm, as all of these letting killers loose ops and surveillance of the murder ops are like a chess game to take control of the board. The surveillance especially is what ops transitioned into for many. A few other famous chess moments. May 11, 1997. Deep Blue Computer first time ever beating a Grand Master chess player who happens to be Russian. May 12, 1997. Russian-Chechnya signed peace accord ending 400 years of conflict. Russia concedes and stops trying to take over. Beaten by a computer. I'm not sure how the symbol of losing to a computer ties into Russia stopping a takeover, but the symbols seem clearly tied. Russia/Russia. And it involves Russia losing and not putting a king in place. I suppose it's less that a computer beat Russia so much as Russia lost at taking a king. Anyway. January 20, 1886. First World Chess Championship and title begins. January 19, 1886. Presidential Succession Act of 1886, which makes it so that killing a president doesn't just give it to the other political party. This may be a coincidence, but given Lincoln had just been killed by an op tied to chess, it seemed interesting that they happened within a day of each other. Effectively, this prevented a takeover potential by killing the top two. This would happen a few years later with the VP plus POTUS deaths leading to Teddy Roosevelt. Now, who are some famous chess players? Ben Franklin. My prior decode on him fits perfectly with chess symbols. Why Benjamin Franklin comms? June 6, 1752. Third Great Fire in Moscow in 2 weeks, 1/3 of city destroyed. June 10, 1752. Benjamin Franklin uses a kite key to collect the fire of lightning. Ben Franklin was the most famous of the American founders, and he traveled to other countries like France, setting up connections allowing the United States of America to fight off Great Britain. Meaning, when the news is, Ben Franklin collected fire, plus Russia set on fire, it meant that Ben Franklin was the face of the ops that had infiltrations in Russia, and they just set it on fire, which likely caused what? It meant Russia would have to abandon whatever campaign they were running against the colonies and pull troops into their homeland to deal with the country burning down. This is a perfect example of an explanation comm given in the press hundreds of years ago. I cover these all the time, and so some massive secret operation takes place but 99% of the comms-aware people haven't got a clue about it as it happens, therefore a major news story is circulated informing them. These Ben Franklin comms let allies know that Ben Franklin's overseas cells had acted, and that's why the people at the time people were said to see such strange things happen, people suddenly abandoning secret positions to get back to Russia due to fire. This comm explicitly references cells run by the founders of the USA in the 1700s in another country. It could even be considered an early proto-CIA given how similar that is to what it is now. A few other curious timings. January 11, 1886. First Chess Championship, Wilhelm of Germany beats UK champ. March 9, 1888. Death of Kaiser Wilhelm 199 days. June 15, 1888. Wilhelm becomes President of Prussia, leads to WW1. June 20, 1888. UK champ defeated by Wilhelm's death. June 20, 1888. Zukertort Death Chess champ beaten by Wilhelm 2 years prior. First chess champ. The point here being a guy named Wilhelm is the first chess champ, and it's tied to a powerful figure with the same name, and then we have these deaths of the chess players involved that just so happen to coincide with the power changes in the country. I doubt that's a coincidence, but it needs more digging to understand the full meaning. Anyway, let's get back to Silence of the Lambs. Buffalo Bill, imported eggs. So this is the scene where the movie gets its logo, the Asian death head moth. Note the symbol here, imported eggs. Foster adoption as in foreign cells, coordinating takeovers by funding/encouraging MK ops, creating Buffalo Bill types to remove political enemies. This ties into the primary victim to rescue the Republican senator's kid. Foster discusses her childhood with Lecter in an exchange of information. That her father died due to burglars he tried to stop at a drugstore. Drugstore being symbolic of drug-fueled killers. The tool of psychologists. Then a discussion of Buffalo Bill not really being a transsexual, but believing he is. This is stated to be a disturbed mind created by trauma systemically as in intentionally. MK Ultra. He hates his own identity and so tries to become someone else. Note the poodle Buffalo Bill keeps hostage along with the girl. This explains another comm I had covered. The very first Beavis and Butthead, which was Liquid Television, 1991, top segment. That's the same year Silence of the Lambs came out, though Frog Baseball technically came out in 1992. It involved Beavis and Butthead escalating pranks until they go after a rich woman's poodle with a bat. Check my Voyager post for more. Beavis and Butthead decodes. It's quite relevant here. Hopkins makes a deal with the Republican senator if he catches Buffalo Bill. Only he didn't give them the name directly. There are many ways I could interpret that last bit. It's not as clear as most of the rest, but it being fool's gold makes me think of rejecting demands and instead forcing cooperation. We get the story behind Silence of the Lambs, that Foster became a foster child after upsetting her family's lamb slaughter operation. This is a symbol tied to Foster herself as her family is tied to those ops. So she symbolizes someone in that system trying to fight against it. Sheep symbolizes someone that follows orders, and it applies to pretty much the entire world that isn't comms aware. The mass killing of those that follow. So in that sense it's a positive comm. Now we have to reconcile his escape. Notice he is served lamb chops and then calls the man he kills Bill. The dead father was also named Bill. Remember, Foster symbolizes someone that came from that world, and the villain is named Buffalo Bill. I believe the symbolism here is of removing bad actors. It has to work as a movie first, and so having him kill while sending a symbol like this, but moreover it's someone that is visibly clean, as many involved in that system are. Only by use of comms are they identified as anything else. I could be reading too deeply into this, though it is awfully strange for anyone to write a screenplay that wins so many Emmys and name practically every named character Bill. The idea of a making a woman suit. Note his name, John Grant. Symbol of being funded. Already discussed the poodle, but this next scene has the victim literally holding it as she is rescued, which not only further ties the two symbols, but it also gives her character a slight upgrade from typical captured victim trope where they are just props. Foster finds the killer. Death, and then the light breaks in. Rewards of capture equals upward mobility in FBI. I'm reminded that Ghislaine Maxwell's family worked for the FBI. And then the cannibal at loose, which given all we discussed is not necessarily a negative com. Though I say that, I know MK didn't stop, and so in a way it feels a bit hollow to me, but the comms do suggest at least some effort was made before now to mitigate this monstrosity. I believe we are only now in the end game of it this year, but whether they can finish it all of is yet to be seen. In my view, disclosure is necessary to keep people from being sheep. Giving the tools necessary to understand the world would be the best thing, but I'm not yet sure that's on the table. Still, as long as I can post, there is one part of the internet that can help free minds. When I think of all the awesome things that could happen if people just understood the world a little better, it boggles the mind, but that's a discussion for another time. So this all brings us back to Buffalo Bills. Remember, the Super Bowl connection was the same time as the movie. What did it mean for the Buffalo Bills to lose? The symbol of Buffalo Bills is in the violent takeover of a new home, and so while there was takeover, it wasn't violent at the highest levels. Thus the Buffalo Bills lost. The killers raised internationally, aliens, being moved against around the world. Like in The Silence of the Lambs, his character goes after aliens, which, as I often explain, symbolizes foreign loyal ops. Now that we've discussed this, let's bring it back to the most famous player for the team. Of course. Buffalo Bills, O.J. Simpson. It's easy for people like me who have little interest in sports to forget how famous he was before the murder trial. It is probably the most publicized trial of all time. It's certainly the trial I've heard about more than any other in pop culture. I didn't go into this assuming there would be comms, but I found plenty. Notice Ted Bundy was the first criminal trial to be nationally televised. That's relevant because, where did O.J. Simpson allegedly kill his victims? Bundy Drive equals O.J. Simpson murder house. That's quite a coincidence. The point is, it seems the most famous murder trial of all time may have been planned out as media. Does that make the murders not real? Not necessarily, but it seems like what happened was planned out as a media circus. Note, Buffalo symbolism is tied to stupidity and mass extermination. If it is real, then the methodology involved is simply O.J. Simpson being conditioned from a young age. This fits with some of what we see in his biography. Note the time he spent as a youth incarcerated as well as the domestic abuse leading up to it. His brother, for example, being Truman, as in the president that made the CIA. The point in using shells to avoid capture. What was O.J. famous for in sports? Being uncatchable. Reconcile with his famous verdict day. He was also the last person to carry the ball for the AFL before the merger with the NFL. Leading to NFL overtaking baseball in ratings. Note his start was in 1969. O.J. Simpson's shtick when it came to football was this: the juice is loose, as in his crew made O.J. uncatchable. And to get the juice loose you needed the electric company. A name shared with the Electric Company kids show that began around the same time. Development began literally the same year O.J. joined the majors. The Son of Sesame Street, made by psychologists. The most expensive and complicated television series to date. Which means it has a pretty important set of comms to it. It having lineage tied to Sesame Street is a pretty big clue, as I already decoded that one. Open Sesame, symbolism. Here are a few screenshots from the first episode. Kids shows. When I mentioned Bundy plus Simpsons, you probably recall that those were the first two popular shows of the Fox network. I've decoded both as comms tied to surveillance of MK families. April 5, 1987, Married with Children debut football story, the longest-running non-live sitcom. April 19, 1987, Simpsons debut, football imagery, the longest-running live Fox sitcom. I didn't know until today they came out the same month. I had decoded them as connected due to all sorts of other comms, like for example the very first short. Bart presented as highly intelligent and inquisitive, but then Homer gives him a nonsensical answer, and he makes crazy eyes. This is symbolic of MKing kids by giving them bad information. One kid moves up in the world, one kid gets sacrificed. Both kids are bugged and watched by overseas agents as all this takes place. Bart after this short is portrayed as dumber and imitating Homer as he descends the evolutionary ladder. Lisa meanwhile hears about bed bugs, which is symbolism for spying. This is tied to her symbolism, which is tied to computers used in spying. Her name, Lisa, is a symbol of spy ops, as the Apple, Lisa, represented the high-end computer that would be used for that purpose. 1976, first Apple Mac released $666.66. 1978, Steve Jobs' daughter Lisa Brennan born. 1978, Apple Lisa project begins. Plus 9 years. 1987, Steve Jobs acknowledges for the first time Lisa is his 9-year-old daughter. 1987, Simpsons premieres with Lisa Simpson as the smart 8-year-old daughter of a nuclear power plant worker. Bundy, which is the show even more obvious for MK as it involves the most dysfunctional family to ever appear on TV to that point. An alcoholic father who dreams of murdering his wife and constant jokes about it. Subtext involves incest, but check my other posts for that. Note how Al Bundy's first role was released the same week Ted Bundy would be sentenced to death. Note how the film is titled Cruising, Driving and is about a Ted be doing tech support to pay bills and being mutilated due to relationship problems. The symbol being manning the surveillance ops tied to killers. The starter pack to move up in the world back in the 80s. O.J. Simpson by living at Bundy House has symbolism tied to these killer ops. Obviously we are decoding the comms long after he became famous. To decode we need the origins, and when did he become famous? He was famous long before he was a pro football player. Sweet Home, Horror Origins. Note this documentary about him and the anticipation of him going pro. This is because he was the most famous college player of his time. December 1974. Big Mac Special Sauce Name Change. December 1974. O.J. Simpson, Juice on the Loose, directed by George Romero, known for Dawn of the Dead. Let's go through those ingredients. Pickles equals CIA. Lettuce equals money. Cheese equals recording. Onions equals layers. Sesame seeds equals variety of cells open. Then the special sauce, which represents that juice is loose. Note the director of that O.J. Simpson film. George Romero, of all people, directing O.J. Simpson. Dawn of the Dead. This means we can decode his work to further define O.J. symbolism. I already did this, and the symbol of the original popular zombie film was tied to a foreign dictator taking over Panama, critical trading route, after being overthrown by military coups twice before. October 1, 1968. Night of the Living Dead debut, beginning of zombie genre, symbol of something dead coming back and dying again. October 1, 1968. President of Panama twice deposed returns and quickly is given another coup. October 11, 1968. Panamanian coup for recently elected president. The military may have literally murdered the person at the head, and therefore the force behind the man used his name and just continued on as it held a meaning for the people. Something that they would vote for. Therefore the original, zombie, symbolism was in someone returning from death/defeat only to quickly die again. Over and over there is this symbol tied to O.J. of death to take over, and it actually goes quite a bit deeper. Keep the connection with the original zombie film to O.J. Simpson in mind for a moment. Beetlejuice is a film from around the same time as those Buffalo Bills comms. Note it's a movie with a ghost trying to remove new residents of a home. Employing a ghoul that appears as a giant snake and is represented by orange juice. O.J. plus Beetle, bugging. To communicate with Beetlejuice for a contract, charades are required. As in using comms rather than creating an evidence trail. When did this film come out? March 30, 1988. Beetlejuice, Ghosts Hiring Monsters to Take Over House. March 31, 1988. Beloved Pulitzer, story about haunting plus Sweet Home plus Denver. That struck me as an unlikely coincidence as both involve ghosts, so digging a little deeper. March 30, 1988. Beetlejuice, Ghosts Hiring Monsters to Take Over House. March 31, 1988. Beloved Pulitzer, story about haunting plus Sweet Home plus Denver. January 21, 1989. Sweet Home Movie. September 9, 1989. Beetlejuice Show. December 15, 1989. Sweet Home Video Game, Origin of Survival Horror Games. The Original Resident Evil. January 27, 1991. Buffalo Bills' first of 4 consecutive Super Bowl losses. January 30, 1991. Silence of the Lambs, Catching Buffalo Bill. December 6, 1991. Beetlejuice Ends. Sweet Home was the original Resident Evil and the origin of all survival horror games. A game that came out around the same time of Beloved, which had Sweet Home as a major plot element tied to a horrific and traumatic place. That's far too specific and timed precisely to be coincidence. The story involves a mother terrified returning to the life of a slave and so decides to murder her eldest daughter. Child sacrifice come, and then the sacrificed daughter returns as a ghost. October 8, 1998. Citigroup founded by Al-Walid. October 8, 1998. Beloved film Oprah Winfrey stars $80 million budget. The story also involves the ghost daughter using ghost powers to restrain the father and rape him. This and other aspects of the comms are symbolizing the ops tied to child sacrifice and blackmail. People sacrifice a child for upward mobility to avoid being a slave. This story is romanticizing the process. The idea of the sacrificed daughter immobilizing and raping the father is a parallel to the sedation ops where a child is sedated and raped. It is simply flipped around to work for horror here. The one good daughter is named Denver, which is symbolism of the data ops. Having Denver be played by an actress named Kim is a reference to the data ops tying from Denver to North Korea, as Kim is typically the go-to-com for the later, ruled by a Kim Jong. The Sweet Home symbol is tied to the horrific enslavement of the past. The point of those ops and MK in general is in the takeover. A sweet home being a desirable location marked for takeover, the impetus for the MK ops. The story is about a sacrificed child and a dramatization of moving past the act of sacrificing them. Rationalizing the act as a necessary one to survive in the world. This ties into the timeframe as the Buffalo Bills were just starting their Super Bowl run. Buffalo Bills equals Indian takeover by mass slaughter. It's about moving into a new home that doesn't belong to you and taking over it by killing/scaring the old tenants away. This brings us back to the most prominent Buffalo Bills symbol, O.J. Simpson. What comms were sent through his life? Where did he meet Nicole Brown? Well, that'd be when she was in high school and working as a waitress at the original Celebrity Only Club. I note a few points tied to named dishes as they have comms I've described before. So, a club where celebs are introduced to high school girls. Note the Russian connection to the ownership. O.J. Simpson got more attention than any other movie star in Hollywood. That's an admission on just how big he was. This is why this doesn't surprise me. The day O.J. got the divorce filed was the same day the transition hit from USSR Space Agency to Russian Space Agency. February 25, 1992, Roscosmos Space formed. February 25, 1992, Nicole Brown Simpson divorce Bundy Drive. Given this symbol when Nicole Brown divorced, it may have represented a breakaway of the new Russia from the old USSR system. The new system punishing O.J. Simpson alongside as the Buffalo Bills were hitting the Super Bowl for loss after loss. The public messaging in rejecting those ops. The entities left behind tied to Simpson may have sent a strong message to demonstrate control flexing media/court/celebrity/race strings. This implies a distinction in purpose between the two periods of time. O.J. was likely originally proxy for something tied to making stars by blackmail with his celebrity club marriage in 1977, but before that it seemed entirely focused on MK and Buffalo takeover ops. January 28, 1969 O.J. Simpson first pick draft Buffalo Bills UC running back. January 29, 1969, original civilian CIA Director Allen Dulles death. Transition of CIA comms with symbolic passing of torch. Dulles was the guy most tied to setting up MK after all. MK and star making are tied together because that's how people buy their way into that club. How are stars made after that? Blackmail? How do we discuss that in comms? Remember Studio 54? February 4, 1980, Studio 54 closes, Celebrity Sex Dungeon. February 4, 1980, Dr. Slump begins, little girl with tape recorded built into her by perverted scientist. This ties into his name O.J. equals Oriental comms as a way to tie foreign club surveillance. October 23, 1996, O.J. Simpson civil trial begins in Santa Monica, California. October 25, 1996. Tomb Raider equals Tom Brady equals Brady com plus murder plus sex digging up. The civil trial is exactly where they dug up the skeletons in the closet with him tied to a celebrity sex club, but it's often about a lot more than one person. Simpson as a symbol ties to surveillance of many people, and so news revolving around him can be placeholders for something much bigger going on. A transition took place after 1977 with changes to how classified data hit in Q clearance. 1977 is also the last year O.J. played for the Buffalo Bills. March 30, 1977, White Buffalo Hunt. May 19, 1977, Smokey and the Bandit premiere $300 million on $4 million budget, escape from police with Carrie in white dress. May 19, 1977, Nicole Brown turns 18 years old. May 20, 1977, Nicole Brown graduated high school. June 1977, O.J. Simpson meets Nicole at Celebrity Club. October 9, 1977, O.J. Simpson Buffalo Bills injury ends Buffalo career. 1977 film, Killing the White Buffalo. White being an exposure comm. This is why more secrecy was built through Q clearance in 1977, and it looks like O.J. with his injury and sudden relationship with Nicole Brown was one of several markers for that transition. Here's a show O.J. starred in during his prime. September 14, 1973, Congress votes to limit NFL blackout. September 16, 1973, Broncos/Bengals NFL injury leads to lawsuit on NFL violence. September 17, 1973, Simpson rushing record. This court case would be resolved in 1977 with the assertion that violence is ruled part of the game. August 18, 1977, Hackbird v. Bengals Colorado court ruled violence is a part of the game. August 18, 1977, Elvis funeral tens of thousands. This was notable in 2012 as this case was tied to the Bounty Scandal ruling. March 2, 2012, Bountygate Scandal NFL announces evidence-created program. March 1, 2012, Breitbart killed. Bounty Scandal. Paying people to take players on the other side out of the game. The scandal being the public marker for the discussion of the hit. Once again takeovers. With hit jobs on media figures on the other team. A movie he starred in, Killer Force, The Diamond Mercenaries. January 14, 1976, Seattle Mariners voted in. January 14, 1976, O.J. Simpson, Killer Force Bradley mission. This Seattle change might be tied into changes with O.J., more data ops. In this case it's tied into the phone line data ops which bled into the internet as years went by. Other posts go into this extensively. June 7, 1994, Speed, bomb on a bus needs to drive for hours or explodes. June 15, 1994, LA Galaxy MLS top current U.S. team overall founded. June 17, 1994, DirecTV ATT. June 17, 1994. White Bronco police pursuit of O.J. Simpson for hours. June 17, 1994. FIFA World Cup US host Brazil wins. A white Bronco. The defining attribute of a Bronco is that it is untamed/untrained/wild. It's not an animal but a state of being. This makes it unique compared to tigers, which are trained in the circus and can often symbolize killers let loose. Broncos represents a lack of control. The Broncos tie to data ops of surveillance is of the people not already under control. The most desirable to surveil. Bronco equals lack of control. Denver symbolism ties into data transition due to the Q clearance connection/DIA bunker I'm often talking about. So a chase of a white Bronco is in the chase of that which can't be controlled. ATT DirecTV could represent that new data channel as they have been tied to those kinds of things before. October 16, 1977. Buffalo Bills 14-game losing streak ends. October 16, 1977. Raiders' 17-game winning streak ended by Broncos beginning a legendary rivalry. The calm for Buffalo Bills suddenly winning is not getting caught, which is tied to the data changes going on in 1977. This in turn is tied to the Denver comms, which is literally where the new place was carved to send nuclear material. Remember that the O.J. support team was called the electric company that supplied him the juice. 1977 is when the electric company show ended and O.J. got injured, leading to his departure from Buffalo. Suspenders. Now if the murders were comms, then what did Goldman symbolize? July 2, 1968. Ron Goldman waiter raised in Buffalo Grove. July 2, 1968. Shonen Jump launched. Jump symbolism I've covered in several posts as it is tied to foreign data handling. There are a lot of comms that tie into that, but these are tied into steel/cars/tech, and it bleeds into phone/internet as time goes on. Seattle Mariners were owned by Nintendo, which had many of its earliest big games tied to Shonen Jump, Dragon Quest. Nintendo of course bought the Seattle Mariners, which began in 1977. This is the same year Miyamoto joined Nintendo. His entrance ties into the sudden shift in fortunes to the company, the point at which cooperation was reached to leverage underground ops in exchange for business success. Up until this week I was under the presumption this was distinct from the larger Japanese populace and government, but it's become clear it's bigger than that. A week ago I decoded suspenders as a clothing symbol tied into not letting a country fall. This gives us a much better concept of the symbol of Mario in relation to Japan, as his outfit represents the same thing. The Italy plus New York connection defining the cooperation with foreign cells on their end. The point of having a middle-aged everyman, ordinary odd-job man, is in what the success of the franchise represents to the country. There are many more comms tied into it as I've gone over, but this seems to be the root. The underlying point of why this specific symbol is so prominent as it represents the livelihood of Japan itself. What keeps Japan from falling? That which keeps the country afloat. September 3, 1946. Operation Paperclip classified program to integrate World War II enemies. September 3, 1946. First President of Nintendo birth. September 3, 1946. Canada FA, aka Five Eyes. Paperclip is typically viewed in context of Germans being integrated secretly into Gov, but of course the Axis also included Japan. So having the president of Nintendo tied to Operation Paperclip helps clarify the global infiltration. Now, given we've discussed how these ops were tied to early sitcoms, this is a repeating history. I've gone through South Park as a more modern tie to these ops, and note during the timeframe South Park began they had a big budget film before it took off in production. 1997 Orgasmo porn parody Trey Parker/Matt Stone. 1997-2023, South Park, Trey Parker/Matt Stone. 1998 Basketball, Trey Parker/Matt Stone 23 million budget. 1999-2023, Family Guy Seth Green. 1999, Idle Hands, Seth Green $25 million budget. This could be a coincidence, but it's curious that these two legendarily long animated TV sitcoms with a young audience focused on fart and poop jokes, early seasons, both had the primary cast of which star in a big-budget films with the same budget and same time relationship. I mean, that's quite an oddity if you consider how rare it is to be cast in such a film or get a show pitched. It's not like they got the roles for prior fame, it's all just a coincidence. They both got breaks in the same ways with the same audience with the same budgets, subject matter, and so on. Also, note the origin of Seth Green's interview being tied to Buffalo Bill, as he got the job by impersonating the character. Idle Hands starred Seth Green and had a Buffalo subplot that, if you watch the film without digging into the history, will make no sense. That's Seth Green saying "Go Go Buffalo" in a sports celebration as a reaction to the cop being murdered. A film about a possessed hand that murders people. In the film there is no explanation as to why he says, "Go, go, Buffalo," but in the commentary track Seth Green mentions that there was a cut subplot of the film involving the high school football team, Buffalo. The cops being old school associates of theirs. Idle Hands. This one is easy because it's an extension of another com I've already decoded. It's useful because it'll reinforce those decodes while also helping to clarify more precision at every angle. This film was released the same month as Columbine and got flack for it as it involves a teenager killing other teens and cops. The coms in the film are not pro-Columbine, but they do appear to represent a countermeasure, so to speak, for it. One of many with the same message on how to stop MK kids from being used to kill. Note Jessica Alba and Allison Mack prior to this film were stars of Venus Rising. She plays the child version of a sex symbol, and that gets to the point of it. If you remember the connection I made before with Beavis and Butthead using Silence of the Lambs symbolism, that's because those comms initially were in support. This changed based on the comms of Beavis and Butthead Do America. In that film the symbol was of taking the violence-conditioned youth and turning dangerous people into brain-dead stoners/pornography addictions. Idle Hands symbol, keeping them busy with masturbation and pot so as to prevent activations. This is the plot of the film, as we'll see, though there is more to it than just that. The movie begins with parents getting killed by an unseen assailant, which we learn later is the possessed hand of their lazy teenage son. Only one of his hands is possessed though, because he masturbates and lights up pot with the other. It'd be hard to be more clear than that. So yeah, it's suggesting that if they condition the youth into looking at pornography and smoking weed, then they won't go out and murder. It provided a solution that may not have done anything to the specific vices but instead fed additional layers of mental illness into the population. At least that's one way to look at it. As optimistic as I am, I can't help but be a little disturbed by this. The world needs to evolve beyond the need for shepherds to brainwash one bad habit into another. Regardless, this is likely an origin of the biggest and longest-running cartoons of all time. Family Guy, 1999-2023, and South Park, 1997-2023. Tantamount here as Idle Hands stars Family Guy's Seth Green and Baseketball with Matt and Trey Parker. Seth Green's also has 20 May 2023, Robot Chicken as well. Symbol of a Manchurian Candidate, chicken, brainwashed into sedation with pot jokes. Note the very first sketch is a monkey, imitation comms, with a fork, Satan instrument, in an electrical socket, followed by a rhino having sex with a car. The symbol being turning from dangerous imitation again into harmless sex despite being a dangerous animal. You already know the symbol, but there are plenty of things left to decode. For example, note his inhaler as a bong followed by Mr. Magoo. This is as he remains unaware of the murderer at large, symbol of him being unaware. So he goes to get more weed but finds them holding their balls instead. As in about to be pushed into lust. After the testes joke, he gets introduced to his love interest in the film, Jessica Alba, who he is said to have a creepy obsession with watching. She drops her lyrics, symbol of music, in getting someone to dance, as in follow. I also notice they use the words sweet love to represent what he will do to Jessica Alba. The same exact wording chosen for Stan in regard to Wendy in the pilot episode of South Park. Chef gets Stan to focus on sex. So, same symbol here. The main character in Idle Hands plays Stan in the Eminem music video. Sweet Love. Do you remember Sweet Home? The symbol of taking over territory using Buffalo Bill style ops. Reconcile this with Sweet Love context. Sweet Home becomes Sweet Love when the ops became tied to pacifying the monsters, which was done through pornography, games, weed, and other things to keep Idle Hands busy and subdued. Note the weed they smoke is from a naked lady, and then he goes to pursue Jessica Alba. Venus. And the witch, the lyrics of her book which he sings to her later. She said she wrote them when she was 13. Then it shifts to Beaver. Beaver being popular slang for sex at that time. Lyrics of Devil Girl with nothing to lose, wind in her hair and gum on her shoes, in the form of magazine clippings. This is symbolic of the ops, as wind is voice, and in this case media voice due to magazine clippings. So taking ops from media. Hair is puppet string, so taking the comms, and then you get gum on her shoes. Now that may seem bad, but gum is a comm I've gone over. Gum symbol, tying into the funding ops. In this case funding these surveillance ops. The first bubble gum tied into stock crash. As in bubble stocks, which is effectively symbolic of stock manipulation and making one company/figure bubble in wealth. I already went over this one, but here's a new one I found. January 19, 1915, Double Mint Gum trademark registered. January 15, 1915, Japan claims economic control of China. July 27, 1914, World War I. July 28, 1914, Double Mint Gum first used. Double mint, as in two different printing mints with a takeover of the banks. In context of Idle Hands, it's effectively saying following ops equals getting funding. What being funded? Well, remember, it then went to Beaver. And then we get another woman often playing a sexual role. Liqueur said as liquor, as in curing by sex and addictions, as she meets a pacified drunk in jail. Investigating murders leading to a pentagram, star creation, pointing to the next murder location. Remember that this was the month of Columbine, so they likely knew a massacre was planned. Just like with Silence of the Lambs and the Asian death head moths imported. These aren't comms from those actively tied to those murders, but instead those aware that cells across the world want it to happen and tied to countermeasures coordination. Note he gets a ticket from a couple of cops that bully him, and he takes it and smokes weed out of it as pornography plays. This is likely symbolic for an attempt at activating an MK by pressure, and instead it's resulting in a strong revulsion. He fixes a sandwich, job comm, with white liquid. What might that symbolize, eh? And it's then broken up by a sudden fear of a killer nearby. Remember, his hand already killed a bunch of people. We see him being introduced to sex over and over, which is to pacify this. This leads to a confrontation between the lazy stoner and his killer hand. There is a distinction between the two, and this hand kills his two best friends. Note he tries to stop his hand. This is because, as I showed in various other movies and shows including Hannibal, One Piece, Naruto, and a bunch of others, that hand represents reach, so when we have a symbolic person in a piece of media, they can represent more than just one person. It could be thought of as a group of friends, with the one bad apple being the hand which he has some degree of control over. So after the murder he jumps into the bush of Jessica Alba. It's stupid that despite his insane behavior, covered in blood and violent hand, this girl tries to have sex with him right after meeting. However, if we view this as internet porn, that's precisely the type of encounter that would be expected. No resistance, just pushing forward the whole way. His dead friends come back to life, and this is because they represent the ops. The people watching over the dangerous MK'd kids and guiding them. The end of the film explicitly spells this out. As they are ghosts sent to monitor him to keep him from turning evil. This brings us to what the main character symbolizes. CASPER. Earlier in the film the main character used his dog for protection named Duke. The main character of this movie was most famous for being the human child of Casper. Ghost again with a treasure named Duke. Just like the dog. That treasure being a baseball from the Dodgers. Dodger equals ducking symbol. November 16, 1945, Casper first film. November 20, 1945, Nuremberg trials begin. This explains Casper symbolism, as it represents someone who ducked the ramifications of being tied to Nazi families. Effectively, the kids of Nazis didn't deserve to be hated for the rest of their lives for things out of their control, and so the prominent families tied to comms adopted new identities, becoming ghosts. Effectively dead on paper. This fits right in with idle hands, as people involved surveilling the MK World see activation and then die, not really die, but take on new identities so as to avoid being targeted by the cells bent on creating killers. While we are on the subject, note that Ghosts in Casper is famous for playing ducks. It was a highly successful film. May 26, 1995, Casper film. July 21, 1995, Duke Snyder pleads guilty and gets probation and a fine, ducking jail messaging sent, which explains why they specifically used this guy plus Dodger. Note how it was timed to the Duke, which was the treasure of Casper pleading in court. There's a lot more I could go into, like the red-hooded Wendy, the good little witch, is the sidekick of Casper, tied to kids that get involved in sexual abuse and need new starts. So it all ties together. Anyway, Anton takes on the mission of keeping his hands busy, so they can't kill. This is until the cops trying to activate come by and force it. They hysterically shoot the ghosts and then get judged to die. He cuts off his hand and then microwaves it trapped. Symbol of nuking the killer. The mission of the hand is to kill as many as possible and then drag one person to the netherworld. Recall the Columbine timing. Their neighbor is obsessed with satanic music and acts as Hannibal Lecter did in Silence of the Lambs in giving advice. Very different characters, but due to his satanic connection plus his vehicle driving comms seems to represent the original driver of the hand. Anton decides to start driving his vehicle, using the stoners to shift gears, symbolizing pacification of driving. The band sings the song, I Wanna Be Sedated, and in this context about keeping killers asleep. Scalped as sedation fails. A fear by the stars of trampling going through a fan, which represents Stan, much like the Eminem song The Lunatics MK'd into killing stars. Obsessive. They need to stop the vehicle, which is done with weed, so, sex addiction and marijuana pacification being the answers once again. Going from violent to docile. The final major joke being no explosion but ends in a puff of smoke. Marijuana again. I wanna be sedated, symbolism. All fairly clear. Okay. So right after this film, which starred Family Guy's Seth Green guy film, let's go into the South Park actors movie. Baseketballs. This film begins with Reggie Jackson in the most famous moment of his career, when he hit the third home run at the World Series. The reason the film begins here is Trey Parker as a child catches this ball, and it inspires him to become a sports star when he grows up. Given I've decoded South Park extensively and this was the big budget premiere of the creators/stars. Why this moment? What symbolism could there be for tying South Park, which has comms about computer surveillance, this third home run of Reggie Jackson? Want to take a guess as to when this legendary sports moment happened? October 18, 1977. Reggie Jackson becomes Mr. October, hitting 3 home runs in World Series, feat only ever accomplished by one other. October 18, 1977. Agreement to move nuclear reactor fuel to Colorado. This ties into Matt Stone and Trey Parker being symbols of Colorado. They were both raised in Colorado and South Park is of course takes place in Colorado. It always seems to come back to late 1977 when all those Intel changes were being made. Effectively the change, as best I can tell, was in moving data storage to more secure places overseas where it could never become a legal issue. South Park is an extension of those surveillance ops and is tied into the development of Red Hat Linux as a way to keep connections off the radar. Check Red Hat post for more on that. Why is it so imperative to secure data? Well, what do Matt Stone and Trey Parker symbolize? May 26, 1971. American Pie recorded famous song about the plane crash of various musicians. May 26, 1971. Matt Stone born. A ballad for celebrity murders, and by picking that birthdate to be identified by. Not of the release date but the recording, it ties him to keeping track of highly volatile situations. Things that can never see the light of day. The Columbine teens surely were heavily monitored, and that footage had the potential to both blow the operation if discovered ahead of time, as well as destroy anyone tied to it after. This doesn't mean they were pro-school shootings. As I went through in the other film, many of these comms have what amounts to a cover. With idle hands, that cover was in implying addicting violent individuals with sex to keep them from being destructive. To keep teens from going around and just tossing matches into kindling when bored, for example. I have said before I was MK'd, and I actually knew a kid that did exactly that and bragged about how many fire trucks he would get each time. Anyway, the origins of South Park. You can trace these back to a few places. Like the Spirit of Christmas they handed around with Brian Boitano, who I note was the halftime show for one of those Buffalo Bills Super Bowls. That's a side note, as I haven't decoded him yet, but I have decoded South Park symbolism, which likely had these films that came out that same year as markers for the same thing. South Park ties into the surveillance ops of those kinds of dangerous people. It doesn't necessarily make them pro-MK or anti-MK, though an argument can be made either way. There are some people who monitor without necessarily being tied to as the conditioning. This is part of prevention attempts, so I can't lump everyone together. I suspect people like Matt Stone and Trey Parker were tied to those cells as children, and their morbid sense of humor is due to seeing more extreme than most sensibilities from kids pushed much farther than others ever would. Anyway, so Reggie's third home run is caught by Coop. Coop equals cooperative, the actor portraying the childhood version of Trey Parker. It then discusses how Major League sports have lost their way. Note the name of the athletes selling out, Townsell, and working at a hotel, plus acting as hired guns recruiting from prisons/mental institutions. These are all symbols of the two major types of surveillance ops I've discussed. Blackmailing, hotel, and hired guns, as in MK employed to go and terrorize/kill targets. This also ties into his name, Coop, as in cooperative. The whole film is a story of him starting his own sports league, and when we reconcile this with South Park, the point becomes, in these teams of people newly online with the burgeoning internet banded together to form sets of ops tied to surveillance. The opening flashback transitions to him watering the plants with urine. Symbolism for giving information to future plants, and is a reference to the opening montage we just watched of Reggie and the 1977 home run. Asserting what happened then with transitions is happening again now. South Park creators invent a new game tying baseball with basketball. The first new rule they invent is that you can distract the other player by taking pictures of them. Surveillance comms. They obsess over a girl's underwear and sex toys. This works as a joke, as these things have to work as movies in addition to comms. As a comm, it ties into the ops, as they are pushing sex as a way to pacify dangerous people. My decode on the Full Monty was a similar symbol in that they took over babysitting, surveillance, dangerous people. We will see the same thing here. Note they are about to get their gas shut off as they have no job. This is likely the result of the end of funding with the prior ops I've gone through. Beavis and Butthead, as a show from 1992-1995. Defined local ops funded by unclear cells, likely foreign and domestic. The movie in 1996, however, had very different comms that made very clear a symbolism of switching dangerous people into sexual addictions. There are far too many to go over here, but the very first sequence paints it out. Film begins with Butthead picking up a girl in windows, in full view of Beavis, who then goes from mass destroying the city to interested in ogling a girl. Symbolizes having dangerous individuals switch to pornography. Turning a destructive brainwashed youth into masturbation addiction. This is what they did to pacify the generation they had been using to riot and murder in the early 90s. These ops were likely funded for just a couple of years, and then they had to switch to something else, and that's what these comms were timed to. What next, as the money was about to run out. Mike Judge voices Kenny for a good reason, as the lineage of that show ties into South Park as the most extreme as the adult kids cartoon starring underage kids with plot lines involving the most disgusting topics possible. This was more true in the earliest years, of course. In the very first season they had a live-action section in the Christmas episode with a real baby literally eating excrement. After a vow to get jobs, it transitions into them the next day playing their game and repeating, "Steve Perry," and then Kenny comes over. Perry's symbolism ties into Admiral Perry opening up Japan. It symbolizes an international venture, and more specifically with Steve Perry. January 22, 1949, Stephen Ray Perry born, San Francisco journey. January 22, 1949, Chinatown Telephone Exchange, San Francisco closed. A transition in telecommunications. I'd need to spend more time decoding Journey, though I do notice above that their most successful period began in 1977. So likely it ties into Reggie in 1977 and data changes with foreign ops. This was 1998 after all, just the following year. March 31, 1999, 3G, most famous internet patent. March 31, 1999, Matrix. Unlikely to be a coincidence in timing. The symbol of the movie being using phones to travel online. Note the person that appears when they say, "Steve Perry," is Kenny. Same name as South Park Eternally Dying Child. Making a job out of Lazy Boy, putting it to sleep. Someone dangerous MK symbol, picked on as well as a symbol of surveillance at home. The picking on is a comm here, but not necessarily for pro-MK but monitoring them. This seems to be when funding was ending for the prior efforts of monitoring. The setup of a national league. This is the point of these movies, as they act as beacons for interested parties to access and join others. Giant help wanted signs. A giant house built on the field of play, as it represents these ops being done from home. With idle hands, the villain was dangerous teens being programmed by cells overseas and pacified by marijuana/sex. With this film, the villain is the owner of the Dallas Felons. This distinction means we aren't just talking about the end result, brainwashed killers, but the cause itself in the funders. The player for the Felons tells Coop that his billionaire boss is about to die. This distracts Coop, making him lose the big game. This is a symbol of the threats and takeovers. The plot involves the Felons' owner trying to take over the basketball league, and this begins with the death of the old owner. It doesn't explicitly say that the old owner died from murder. If it did, the whole tone of the film would be more serious, but the symbolism is there. Note, after losing they meet the Make-Wish Foundation girl, dying children. Much like Kenny in that sense here. This is about associating with these kids that are effectively on the chopping block and sacrificed. Dying, in that sense. And so what do they offer her? A pretzel they baked themselves. To which Trey Parker asserts he didn't. This is the same joke in Idle Hands, with the conclusion being they use a bong he says he made himself to pacify the villain. In this case the pretzel is in twisting into knots/going great length. In both cases the joke is in them not really being the one responsible. So, Kenny is the one with surveillance, and notice his number of 23. Symbol of quickly vanishing, 23 skidoo. Matt Stone is 17/Q, symbol of secret information, and Trey Parker is 44, the same as Reggie, who tied into the 1977 data transfer. Note the other teams, with the informant's recording being one of them. To distract a player he cuts off his middle finger as it flips off. Symbol just like with Idle Hands, removing the hand. Finger being an individual, and in this case the one that is being rude. The dying kid learned from their matches, vagina, as that's the sex pushing comm again, and another, made it myself, in this case the lazy boy. And the final wish of the kid is initially in murdering poisoning the reservoir and then switches to sex and finally a request to hang out with the team. Sandwich comms being jobs as I've gone over in many posts. Note it involves a pretty Asian woman in a symbol of sex. This is likely internet porn symbolism as the online avenues were just starting at this time. There is a sandwich comm in idle hands as well. Note it's a murder knife then being covered in white liquid which he eats. Same symbol as the dying boy being taken to the Asian sex parlor. Internet porn. So the South Park creators take the dying kid that wants to poison the water supply under their wing and then get him inebriated before the operation which switches out his liver. There is another level to this as well as water equals info. The act of torturing children effectively making the ops harder to sell in communities. They want to employ MK but don't want to be tied to child torture. They then get to the hospital and do a variety of comedy routines that look like an execution. The operation is a success. They pacify him. A kid who said his greatest wish was in hunting endangered animals and poisoning the public reservoir. They then get blackmailed by the Dallas Felons owner in an effort to take over the league. Initially his push involved applying pressure to the Make-A-Wish Foundation which forced the protagonists to rely on merchandising to fund it. Trey Parker listens to the radio which has a gag on it describing his exact situation. This is symbolism for the music comms, it's mostly just a joke. They have to work for both. The blackmail involved evidence of their bad treatment of children in creating merchandise. This was right after they acted as terrorists to the kid and got him drunk. The primary symbol of taking in Kenny, and the final match involves them using him as a throwing pineapple. Pineapple being the one painful fruit. Kenny asserts he had nobody before being taken in by the South Park gang. They then launch him as a weapon, accidentally, setting off fireworks. At the end he uses his Cartman voice to throw off the Dallas Felons and make them miss. They then win the game with a score of 17-16. The symbol here is in of activating MK as necessary. Cartman, as in they pacify and take control of dangerous MK'd, but they also hold on to them as threats. The sequence where he converts the child sweatshop into adults' factories ties into the switch between the dangerous child poisoning the water supply and the adult, Kenny, being used as a projectile. The psychological abuse they give Kenny along with allowing him to stay with them allows a control that can be cashed in later as they are used in the way MK ops have been used for decades. It's just being presented as slightly less evil. Unsolved Mysteries guy says, we still have no idea where this guy is, which is a joke about how these ops are done remotely. And that's it. The final credits have a song with abusive lyrics, specifically asserting the mother of the listener only pretend to care about them. Symbolism for MKing targets. So the ops here aren't anti-MK like I went in expecting. I honestly thought it was all going to be like the Beavis and Butthead ones with dangerous kids being converted into porn. Instead it's a hybrid in an attempt to walk a line. This is most evident in the principal feature of Baseketball, being the psyche out. Note they reference Beetlejuice and the scaring of old tenants using monsters. The Beetlejuice one was symbolic of using MK. For Baseketball to define one of their psyche outs as the same gives away the symbol of the transition. That they are going to be doing that. Recall the first season of South Park as it involved the kids with the voices of the main characters mocking Cartman for being fat. Not necessarily MK, but it's blurry around the edges. It seems to indicate surveilling and introducing targets to sex, but it also involves abuse. I interpret this as an abusive relationship transitioning into a different dynamic. Or perhaps keeping MK targets sedated until needed. I have a lot more I need to dig into before I can reach a conclusion on specific intent. It may even be muddy on purpose as few people would promote openly unjustifiable evil. Part of it is surely liability as comms rarely twirl an evil mustache and proclaim evil. Even if the comms are negative and creating violent psychopaths, it will still at times have justification or some thin veil pretending it's something it isn't. One last note, I overlooked their first film, so let's quickly go over it. Story of cannibal traveling to Colorado for gold. The star Trey Parker is Jewish, and note the first victim was named Israel. Given the famous story of this cannibal happened during the first migration to Israel, I have a theory. Perhaps comms-aware families employed Packer as guide to Israel during that first migration. He led them to doom. Once caught in the USA, they couldn't very well try him for his real crimes, as an international crime in Israel wouldn't be prosecutable, so they simply told the story as though it was national. Telling a story about cannibalism while gold mining because he had effectively robbed and taken everything from his guests. This is just my at-a-glance hypothesis, as whatever the truth is, they picked this event for a good reason. I might watch it and test my hypothesis later, it just seemed worth mentioning here at the end. I've discussed a lot of comms tied to threats, and it will be educational to take a step back and reflect on products and how they represent intent. Consider the tragedy of Titanic. How do you think this was represented in comms? I've gone through a ton in other posts, and I found a new one this week which really clarifies perception as well as how comms are used over time. Lifesavers. Lifesavers 1912 origin, same year as Titanic. Nautical symbol, tin, involves a story of dying at sea, and most importantly the whole story of Titanic is tied to a rush for lifeboats. The symbol of lifesaver, as it says. The story here is in Titanic happened, and then someone monetizes the symbol through a candy. Lifesavers effectively acts as a symbol of making sure you get on the lifeboat by not making an enemy out of Rothschild. When I consider its prominence from then to now, it forever represents that event. The symbol is identical to the phrase, lifesavers, itself, and yet there's so much more to it. A lot can be learned by reflecting on this symbol and the history. I added a new section to my disinfo post this week, so I'll share that here as well. It's not really related to the post, but I want to make sure people read it. JFK Jr. section. Why do shills so consistently push JFK Jr. as alive? JFK Jr. was confirmed to be more popular than HRC and JFK Jr. and was planning on running for the New York Senate seat that HRC ended up going for. He decided to do that. It ends HRC's chance of becoming president. This is the most likely reason why he would be killed, so that HRC could get the seat, and remove a potential rival for president bid. HRC did get the seat after all, so for him to be alive it doesn't add up. I could do mental gymnastics and imagine a set of circumstances that could allow it. When I contrast it with the shilling, it explains perfectly why they would pick JFK Jr. of all people to promote as alive. Because unlike the many that are alive, for anyone to say JFK Jr. is alive is inherently contradictory to everything he stood for, as he intended on beating back HRC before she took that next step as a senator. Check this post for a bunch of people that are probably alive that have been marked as dead. Shills specifically picked a person they knew wasn't alive, and that could make Q look like an idiot, as Q explicitly said he wasn't alive. Thus every Q follower that promotes the story is effectively calling Q a liar/psyop. It's a win/win for shills. There is no more logical person for them to promote as alive than him. So please think it through before you agree with someone online. I say this despite knowing that most people can't be convinced to rethink their positions, but I've given the ammunition for those that are ready to try. Wrap up. Okay, so we decoded a ton related to Buffalo Bills, so now let's return to discuss Hamlin the football player. This concept again of the safety of Buffalo Bills named Hamlin going into cardiac arrest against the Tigers. Define Hamlin: someone who gets others to follow him and drives rats away. And how are rats driven away? That's by Buffalo Bills symbolism, as it ties into murder ops. So it seems to be symbolism for there no longer being a threat of 187 ops. The one that symbolized the threat has himself succumbed to it. Despite it looking grim, it's a negative symbol being reduced. Also, at the start of the post I talked about this athlete being a replacement for Mr. Hyde. Well, that's a symbol that ties into both MK and Federal Reserve depending on context. The funding of those ops going hand in hand with investment, perhaps. I dug into a ton of Buffalo symbols in this post, and here's yet a few more. Just about every occurrence is tied to murder, drug trafficking, or some calm about mass extermination. Though not all tie to murder openly, and yet when deconstructed they likely are. 1947 football, Buffalo Bison's name changed to Buffalo Bills. March 12, 1946. Now it is Buffalo Bill Dam name change. September 20, 1947. Buffalo Bills Quartet, famous barbershop quartet formed. Suddenly in 1946-1947, multiple Buffalo Bill name changes take place. This was right after World War II. Dam being symbol for keeping information secure. It might connect to the transition at the time involving the takeover of foreign lands with the help of former Nazis. Using drugs and all sorts of tactics to install puppet regimes. Q link to a fascinating document detailing these CIA efforts. When I dug into Buffalo in pop culture, I found a number that tied into funding criminal insurgents. April 27, 2019. Buffaloed film, about escaping Buffalo with hustling and destruction of evidence. April 27, 2019. Pope Francis donates $500K to immigrants trying to reach the USA. 500,000/75K migrants equals 6.66. Though this last one, if you read carefully, you'll notice this is not tied to actually funding criminals but instead setting up traps. How about this song? Home on the range, oh, give me a home, where the buffalo roam. A new home carving it out, where the buffalo roam and where the deer and antelope play. DOE/Q play. Give me a home, as in taking a home. This ties into the symbol of Buffalo Bill Cody taking the home/land by killing buffalo to remove current residents. And more recently. March 8, 2022. Seattle trades Noah for Broncos Drew Lock sign Russell Wilson. March 8, 2022. Ravens NFL star and Super Bowl champ Derek Wolfe causes outrage after killing 2,000-pound buffalo with arrow in childhood dream. Reconcile the whole post as the symbol is well defined now with Buffalo Bills. Takeover comms. Whether it's taking over the White House and using Whitney Hous Eaton as the symbol, or one of the many other examples, and just like the lifesaver comm which ties into Titanic, it can be used in a simple way, lifesaver equals lifesaver, but holds connotation of the origin Buffalo Bills, which involved massacres of livestock to take territory by starving the enemy. It's a ruthless approach and ties into ops funded with an eye on weakening a larger force by going after the things that sustain it. This even includes things like funding psychopaths to pick off the children of the enemies. It's a broad range of hostilities to accomplish an often simple goal of taking out an opponent that can't be approached conventionally. It is in a sense more about weakening than it is outright overthrow. But one leads into the other. Or perhaps a better way to describe it than takeover is give me a home. That seems to be the one part that is essential to all of the iterations. It does have connotation of all sorts of barbarity, but you can have barbarity without home takeover, but I don't think any Buffalo Bill comm can be untethered to the home takeover. It goes back to the origin after all with land takeover. Tiger comms, for example, have no inherent home takeover connotation, only in the deployment of killers. I only figured out the root hours before upload as I had decoded so many comms but not the root until the very end. That's why this post is a little jumbled in places as I kept decoding with the answer not perfectly clear in my head. If I rewrote this post, or practically any of my posts, they would be far better done. These posts are all me solving puzzles, and when I share my notes of those solves it doesn't compare to what you'd see if I focused on teaching. So, bear with me for a little longer. Despite how much effort and time I've put into this, I have no doubt that with the right educational material people could learn what has taken me years in minutes. The primary difficulty of it is accessing the right connections, as they are not made accessible without a lot of effort. I have yet to spend the time necessary to present things in the right way to teach, but I will. I will one day feel comfortable with my own understanding of things and be ready to focus primarily on that. One last thing. Musk asserting his philosophy is to expand the scope and scale of consciousness so that we may aspire to understand the universe. This ideal of striving to understand the universe is a part of my core beliefs as well. When I take a step back and think of how many riddles and dopamine traps have been built into the world, it makes me wonder what it could all be if it were the other way around. There are mysteries people never perceive because they've been too busy with the maze of nonsense hoisted onto them. The dopamine addictions, inflections, or some mania with gender or race getting everyone to fight each other rather than make friends. This extends to inventions as well. How can anyone come up with new ideas when we have the same pool of nonsense to draw from? Creativity is in combining ideas, and when the well of ideas has been sabotaged with gibberish and coded to weaken or destroy us, we can't create anything meaningful. People don't know enough to ask the right questions or even have healthy aspirations, and it all leads to the following generations which are poisoned. Being raised by someone who either knows only the disinfo media pushes is a recipe for disaster over long periods of time. Compulsive schooling makes sure even the few that are smart enough to transcend this nonsense don't remain unscathed. Comms-aware people at a glance have a much better lot, as all the nonsense in the world is coded to be educational to them, but even that is still a cursed existence, I think. So long as it's tied to the poisonings of others and inability to speak freely, it can hardly be an environment to bring out the best in someone. All of us, all of humanity is caught in a labyrinth of strings. Break one string and some rich jerk across the globe puts a hit on you. That's the suffocating reality for those comms-aware people moving up in the world. They survive by attaching strings to themselves of the richest devil around. It's like there's 1,000 different hells, and the best you can hope for is to be able to choose one yourself rather than be so dumb you can't even see the pitfall under you begging to open the moment you step out of line. The more I learn, the more I see it's a mess, but I remain convinced the right people are working on this. I'll keep doing as much as I can, and in time perhaps I'll produce the kinds of materials necessary to wake more people up. Okay, that's it for this week. Telegram chat. Join our Telegram group. Send leads, begin decoding. This has been Buffalo Bill's O.J. Simpson.